of the most powerful criminal organization in the world, has seized the US Go depository at Fort Knox.
GoldenEye-rogue-agent is a first-person shooter developed and published by EA Games and released in November of 2004 on the PS2, Xbox and Gamecube. Although the game shares the name of the N64 classic, GoldenEye-rogue-agent is not a remake or a sequel to the legendary 1997 shooter, but instead a spin-off from the main 007 franchise. The game's story is centered around a nameless agent who was initially working for MI6 and also who recently lost an eye on a previous mission. According to the game's story, this agent is so angry at losing an eye, he has become increasingly violent and brutal as a result. MI6 decide to evaluate his behaviour by putting him through a virtual simulation, and within this mission our protagonist allows this to happen to our beloved James Bond. After failing this virtual test, the agent is then kicked out of MI6 and receives an offer to carry out missions for the notorious Goldfinger. After accepting this offer from the well-known Bond villain, Goldfinger decides to reward his new enforcer by replacing the agent's lost eye with a gold cybernetic eye. And the story only gets more ridiculous from here, but the majority of the campaign involves you completing various tasks for Goldfinger, mixing it up with a number of well-known bad guys from the James Bond franchise. The story is kind of over the top, but unfortunately it's not that so bad it's good kind of over the top, but more gives off the feeling that EA had to make a James Bond game to hold on to the license, and someone struggled for an idea as there wasn't a movie out that year. Now what is strange about this title is that I was actually looking forward to playing this one again. For some reason my memory of this game was that it was a short but sweet and decent shooter with some cool action set pieces and a good selection of weapons. Sadly, my memory of this game was way off the mark, as returning to GoldenEye-rogue-agent, I found genuinely one of the most awkward shooters I've ever played. Now, at first I thought maybe I shouldn't be so harsh on the game, as console shooters back then weren't what they are today. Then I realised this game came out in the tail end of 2004, after such great console shooters as Halo Combat Evolved, Time Splitters, Rainbow Six, and the Chronicles of Riddick. Now those games are pretty much top of their class, and it would be unfair to hold the game to such a high standard. However, when you consider how late it was into the PS2 generation that this game was released, its clunky controls are somewhat baffling. GoldenEye-rogue-agent takes place across 8 missions in the most basic running and gunning gameplay I've seen in quite some time. Each mission tasks you with getting from point A to point B and throws plenty of bad guys at you along the way to shoot out with pistols, SMGs, assault rifles, rocket launchers and more, but everything about the shooting feels very limp. None of the weapons feel like they have much punch to them, and it can be a real struggle to aim accurately, as no matter how many times I adjusted the sensitivity of the X and Y axis, it was impossible to find a sweet spot, and movement always felt too fast or too slow. Luckily, the game is very generous with the enemy hitboxes, meaning you barely have to scrape them to take them down. In my time with the game, I basically encountered the exact same enemy the entire time, meaning the combat gets pretty old pretty fast, and the shootouts present little to no challenge at all, so a lot of the action just feels like a chore. I find it quite ironic that the aiming feels as dated as it does, and the enemies seem to charge at you, as the game sort of actually feels like the 1997 GoldenEye, although I'm sure this wasn't the developer's intent. From a visual standpoint, it seems like the game does its best to take advantage of the familiar types of environments seen in the James Bond movies. You'll fight your way through futuristic secret lairs, Hong Kong rooftops, casinos. All of the different types of environments are here, it's just that they feel a little bland and some areas look more rough than others, but the variety is definitely a bonus. The sound design isn't the best either, and there isn't really any voice acting except for the cutscenes, and most of what you will hear is poor sounding gunfire over the top of some generic techno spy music as you run from room to room. This game's presentation isn't bad, but is possibly the definition of a shoulder shrug.
My name is Pussy Galore. You look like you could use a ride. Climb aboard, GoldenEye.
Overall, the feeling I came away with after playing GoldenEye-Rogue-Agent is that it's a game that feels undercooked. At some point in some office over at EA, someone had a cool idea. Why don't we make a game in the James Bond universe, set amongst all of its most well-known villains, and create a story full of betrayal and double-crossing? This was a decent concept, but everything about this game feels like it could have used another year in development, and Rogue Agent very much feels like a skeleton of a game. The foundation of different characters, weapons and environments is there, but the gameplay lacks any real depth to make the shooter worth playing. At its best, if you're a James Bond fan, you might get a kick out of seeing all of the biggest villains interacting with each other, and the campaign could be completed in a dedicated afternoon. Sadly, the end product is a game that feels incredibly rushed, and only really worth owning if you're a major fan of 007. But no matter your preference, this is still a disappointing first-person shooter that wastes the potential of the franchise it had access to.